The dust settled in long, lazy swirls across the main street of Redemption Springs as Eleanor Blackwood stood on the porch of her father's general store, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. At 22, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunset and eyes that matched the vastness of the western sky, she felt the walls of her predetermined life closing in with each passing day. Her father, Joseph Blackwood, had built the most prosperous business in the small frontier town after arriving from Boston 15 years earlier. A man of stern convictions and even sterner business practices, Joseph believed he knew what was best for his only daughter. A secure future with Reverend Thomas Whitfield, the young preacher who had arrived in Redemption Springs the previous spring. The engagement announcement had been made without Eleanor's consent, a business arrangement between her father and the ambitious man of God who coveted both Eleanor's beauty and her father's wealth and standing in the community. If you're watching this video, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings that lined the main street. Eleanor clutched the railing of the porch, her knuckles white with tension, as she watched the stagecoach roll into town, trailing a cloud of dust in its wake. The weekly arrival of the stage was the only connection Redemption Springs had to the outside world, bringing mail, supplies, and occasionally new faces to break the monotony of frontier life. Today's arrival stirred an unusual amount of interest among the townsfolk, as whispers had spread that a federal marshal might be on board, sent to investigate a series of mysterious cattle rustlings that had plagued nearby ranches. Eleanor watched as the stagecoach came to a stop in front of the town's only hotel, the Pioneer Rest, its wooden wheels creaking under the weight of its journey across the harsh terrain of the Wyoming Territory. The driver, a weathered old man named Hank, who had been running the stage for as long as anyone could remember, climbed down stiffly from his perch. He began unloading luggage and mail bags as the passengers emerged, stretching their limbs after the long, jolting journey. Eleanor's attention was drawn to the last passenger to disembark, a tall man dressed entirely in black, save for a white shirt that had seen better days. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of strength and confidence, seemingly unbothered by the curious stares of the townspeople. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his black hat, but Eleanor caught a glimpse of eyes as sharp and dangerous as a hawk's, and a jawline set in a permanent expression of vigilance. At his hip hung a Colt revolver in a well-worn holster, the weapon fitting against his body as naturally as another limb. "Eleanor!" Her father's sharp voice cut through her reverie, summoning her back into the store. With one last glance at the stranger, she turned and went inside, where Reverend Whitfield waited with her father. The preacher was a handsome man by conventional standards, with neatly combed blonde hair and clear blue eyes that never quite warmed when he smiled. At 30, he had already established himself as a powerful force in town, his sermons drawing crowds from miles around as he preached about sin and redemption with equal fervor. Today, he wore his Sunday best, despite it being a Thursday, a clear indication that this visit was of special importance. Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized this was likely another discussion about wedding preparations, a topic that had dominated conversations in recent weeks. "There you are, daughter," Joseph Blackwood said, his tone softening slightly, though his eyes remained hard as flint. Reverend Whitfield has come to discuss the final arrangements for the ceremony next month. Mrs. Peterson has agreed to handle the refreshments, and the Reverend believes we should invite the county judge to officiate alongside him, a great honor that will surely be remembered throughout the territory. Eleanor nodded silently, her eyes downcast as she listened to the men plan her future as if she were a prized heifer being prepared for auction. The weight of expectation pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe in the already stifling air of the store. Through the window, she could see the stranger in black crossing the street toward the saloon, his movements purposeful yet unhurried, like a predator, confident in its ability to catch its prey. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the town in a golden glow, Redemption Springs transformed from a sleepy frontier settlement to a place of secrets and shadows. Eleanor moved mechanically through the evening meal with her father, the food tasteless in her mouth, as he continued to speak about the wedding plans and how fortunate she was to have caught the eye of such a respectable man as Reverend Whitfield. Later, in the sanctuary of her bedroom, Eleanor opened the window wide, letting the cool night air wash over her flushed face. The distant sounds of piano music and raucous laughter drifted from the Broken Spur Saloon, a place she had been forbidden to even walk past. Tonight, those sounds called to her like a siren song, promising something she had never allowed herself to truly contemplate: freedom. Morning brought no relief from Eleanor's restlessness. As she arranged canned goods on the shelves of the general store, she heard the whispers of Mrs. Davis and Mrs. Henderson, who had come in for flour and the latest gossip. "They say he's a gunslinger," Mrs. Davis said in a hushed tone, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, as if the subject of her gossip might materialize at any moment. "Killed 12 men down in Texas before heading north. Calls himself Cole Thornton, though I'd wager that's not his real name." Eleanor's hand stilled on a can of peaches, her ears straining to catch every word. Mrs. Henderson nodded sagely, adjusting her bonnet with fingers that trembled slightly with excitement. "My herald says he came in on business with the Rockingham Ranch. Something about protecting their cattle drives. But you mark my words, a man like that brings nothing but trouble." The bell above the door jangled, causing both women to fall silent as Sheriff Matthews entered, his weathered face grim beneath his graying mustache. At 60, he had been sheriff of Redemption Springs for over 2 decades, his steady hand and fair judgment earning him the respect of even the most hardened frontiersmen. Today, however, he looked troubled, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "Morning." "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat before turning his attention to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, is you father available? Got some matters of town security to discuss with him." Eleanor nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before heading to the back room where her father was going over the ledgers. She couldn't help but notice how the sheriff's gaze lingered on the street outside, as if expecting trouble to come walking through the door at any moment. Joseph Blackwood emerged from the back room, his ledger still in hand. "Sheriff Matthews, what brings you by so early? I hope there's no trouble." The sheriff removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair, plastered to his scalp with sweat despite the early hour. "Just being cautious, Joseph. That stranger who came in on yesterday's stage, name's Cole Thornton. He's got a reputation that's traveled ahead of him. Nothing confirmed, mind you, but enough whispers to make me wary. I've sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Cheyenne asking for any information they might have on him." Eleanor's father frowned, his gaze flicking briefly to his daughter before returning to the sheriff. "You think he might be connected to the rustling at the Rockingham?" Sheriff Matthews shrugged, his expression noncommittal. "Can't say for certain. Just thought the town council should be aware. Times like these, we can't be too careful." As the men continued their conversation, Eleanor slipped out from behind the counter and headed toward the door, murmuring an excuse about checking their order on the porch. Outside, the morning sun had already begun its relentless assault, but the air still held a hint of the night's coolness. Eleanor took a deep breath, savoring this brief moment of solitude as she arranged the display of tools and farming implements. Her gaze was drawn inexorably toward the Pioneer Rest, where the stranger, Cole Thornton, she now knew, would be staying. As if summoned by her thoughts, the man himself emerged from the hotel, pausing on the boardwalk to light a cigarette. In the clear light of day, Eleanor could see him more clearly, the hard planes of his face, the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. The following days brought a strange tension to Redemption Springs. Like the heavy air before a thunderstorm, Eleanor found herself watching for glimpses of Cole Thornton as she went about her daily routines, her curiosity about the mysterious gunman growing despite the warnings from her father to stay well away from that dangerous drifter. She learned from snippets of conversation that he had indeed been hired by Samuel Morrison, owner of the Rocking M Ranch, to protect his cattle from rustlers during the upcoming drive to the railhead in Cheyenne. The news had divided the town. Some, like Sheriff Matthews, viewed his presence with suspicion, while others, particularly those who had suffered losses from the rustlers, welcomed the addition of a gun hand with a fearsome reputation. Eleanor found herself inexplicably drawn to this man, who lived by his own code, who seemed to carry freedom in his very stance. On Saturday afternoon, as the heat of the day began to wane, Eleanor took advantage of her father's meeting with the town council to slip away from the store. She told Martha, the middle-aged woman who helped with the heavier work, that she was going to deliver a package to Mrs. Wilkins at the far end of town. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did have a parcel for the widow, but her path would take her directly past the Broken Spur Saloon, where Cole Thornton had been spending much of his time when not out at the Morrison Ranch. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she walked down the dusty street, the package clutched tightly in her hands, as if it might provide some protection against her own recklessness. She had nearly reached the saloon when the batwing door swung open, and Cole Thornton himself stepped out, nearly colliding with her. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and smooth like aged whiskey. Up close, Eleanor could see that his eyes were a striking shade of green, clear and piercing beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He smelled of tobacco, leather, and something indefinable, something that made her think of wide-open spaces and freedom. Eleanor found herself momentarily unable to speak, caught in the intensity of his gaze. When she finally found her voice, it emerged as little more than a whisper. "No, I should have been watching where I was going." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, softening the hard lines of his face for just an instant. "You're Joseph Blackwood's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how improper this encounter would appear to anyone who might be watching. "Eleanor Blackwood," she supplied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Cole Thornton, though I suspect you already knew that, given how news travels in a town this size." There was no judgment in his tone, merely a statement of fact. Eleanor felt a flush creeping up her neck, but held his gaze steadily. Yes, Mr. Thornton, your arrival has caused quite a stir in Redemption Springs. His smile widened fractionally, revealing a glimpse of white teeth against his sun-darkened skin. I tend to have that effect wherever I go. He glanced at the package in her hands. Don't let me keep you from your errand, Miss Blackwood. I'm sure your father wouldn't approve of you being seen conversing with the likes of me. There was something in the way he said it, a mixture of resignation and defiance, that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, the moment was shattered by a familiar voice calling her name. Reverend Whitfield strode toward them, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" His gaze shifted between her and Cole, suspicion darkening his features. Eleanor clutched the package tighter, suddenly feeling like a child caught in some misdeed, rather than a grown woman having a perfectly innocent conversation on a public street. "I'm delivering Mrs. Wilkins' order, Reverend. Mr. Thornton and I merely bumped into each other." The preacher's lips thinned into a disapproving line as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the gunman, a physical barrier that spoke volumes about his perceived ownership. "Your father mentioned you might be running errands. I thought I would escort you back to the store when you're finished." His tone made it clear this was not an offer, but a command. Cole Thornton regarded the preacher with a cool assessment that missed nothing, from the man's carefully styled hair to his polished boots. "Reverend," he acknowledged with a nod that held neither respect nor animosity, merely recognition. Whitfield drew himself up to his full height, still falling short of the gunman by several inches. "Mr. Thornton, I understand you've been hired by the Morrison Ranch. I pray your services won't be needed for long in our peaceful community." The barb was thinly veiled, but Thornton seemed unaffected by it, his expression remaining impassive. "Peace is a relative term, Reverend. Some might say it's merely the quiet before bullets start flying." He touched the brim of his hat once more, his eyes briefly meeting Eleanor's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Blackwood, good day to you both." With that, he stepped around them and continued down the boardwalk, his spurs jingling softly with each measured step. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, the church bells ringing out across Redemption Springs with a clarity that seemed to pierce Eleanor's very soul. She sat stiffly in the front pew beside her father, her back ramrod straight, in her best dress of pale blue cotton, a matching bonnet shading her face from the colored light that streamed through the stained glass windows. Reverend Whitfield stood at the pulpit, his voice rising and falling with practiced cadence as he delivered a sermon about temptation and the narrow path of righteousness. Eleanor couldn't help but feel the words were directed specifically at her, especially when the Reverend's gaze would find hers among the congregation. "The devil comes not with horns and a pitchfork," he thundered, "but in pleasing forms that appeal to our baser natures. He comes offering freedom when what he truly brings is damnation." The wooden pew felt increasingly uncomfortable beneath Eleanor as the sermon continued, the Reverend's words weaving a tapestry of guilt and obligation that threatened to smother her burgeoning thoughts of rebellion. After the service, the congregation gathered outside the church for the usual Sunday socializing. Eleanor stood dutifully by her father's side as he discussed business with other prominent citizens, nodding politely whenever the conversation turned to her upcoming wedding. "You must be so excited, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, patting Eleanor's hand with fingers that felt like dried twigs against her skin. "Reverend Whitfield is such a fine catch, educated, respectable, and with such a promising future ahead of him." Eleanor murmured a noncommittal response, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the street, where Cole Thornton stood leaning against a hitching post outside the general store, apparently waiting for something or someone. As if sensing her scrutiny, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the distance with unerring accuracy. For a long moment, they stared at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that Eleanor couldn't quite define, but felt deep in her bones. The week that followed brought an escalation in tensions both within the town and within Eleanor herself. News arrived that another ranch had lost cattle to the rustlers, this time with the added violence of a wounded ranch hand who had stumbled upon the thieves in the act. Sheriff Matthews organized a meeting at the town hall, calling for volunteers to form a posse. Eleanor watched from the window of the general store as men gathered, rifles in hand, determination etched on their weathered faces. Among them was Cole Thornton, standing slightly apart from the others, his presence both intimidating and reassuring. Samuel Morrison, a barrel-chested man with a booming voice that matched his physical stature, argued heatedly with the sheriff about strategy while the assembled men listened. Eleanor couldn't hear their words clearly, but the tension was evident in their postures and gestures. That evening, as Eleanor helped close up the store, her father broke the news that had been circulating through town since the meeting. "The Morrison Ranch is moving up their cattle drive," he said, checking the lock on the cash drawer before sliding it shut with a definitive click. With these rustlers getting bolder, Samuel doesn't want to risk losing any more of his herd before they reach the railhead. They'll be leaving at the end of the week. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bolt of fabric she'd been refolding. "Will Mr. Thornton be going with them?" she asked, striving to keep her voice casual despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Joseph Blackwood frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded his daughter. That gunslinger? Yes, that's what he was hired for after all. And good riddance, I say. Men like that bring nothing but trouble. He moved closer, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder in a rare gesture of affection. Which reminds me, Reverend Whitfield has suggested moving up the wedding date. With all this unrest, he feels it would bring some much-needed joy to the community. I've agreed. 2 weeks from Sunday, you'll be Mrs. Thomas Whitfield. The news hit Eleanor like a physical blow, the walls of her future contracting even more rapidly than she had feared. 2 weeks, she repeated, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. But we had agreed on next month. There's so much still to prepare. Her father waved away her objections with a dismissive hand. Martha can help with whatever remains to be done. The Reverend is right. This town could use something positive to focus on right now. He smiled, oblivious to the turmoil in his daughter's eyes. Besides, I'm not getting any younger, Eleanor. I'd like to see my grandchildren before I'm too old to bounce them on my knee. The casual mention of children, her children with Reverend Whitfield, sent a wave of panic through Eleanor that was so intense she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. The thought of being forever bound to a man she respected but did not love, of bearing his children and living out her days as the perfect preacher's wife, suddenly seemed not just unappealing, but utterly suffocating. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor as she tossed and turned in her narrow bed, her mind racing with thoughts she had never before allowed herself to fully contemplate. The face of Cole Thornton kept appearing in her mind's eye, not just his physical features, which were undeniably striking, but the sense of untamed freedom that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a fire. In just a few days, he would ride out with the cattle drive, disappearing from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. And in 2 weeks, she would be irrevocably tied to Reverend Whitfield, a future as fixed and immutable as the mountains that framed the horizon. Something broke loose inside Eleanor then, a dam of propriety and obedience that had been holding back the current of her true desires. With a clarity that was almost startling, she realized she could not, would not, let either of those things happen without at least attempting to seize control of her own destiny. Dawn found Eleanor moving with quiet determination, packing a small valise with only the essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the modest savings she had accumulated from helping in the store. She dressed with care in her most practical outfit, a dark blue riding skirt and matching jacket over a simple white blouse. Her movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the frantic beating of her heart. The house was silent, save for the distant sound of her father's snoring, the familiar creaks and settles of the wooden structure, a backdrop to what she knew would be her final morning in the only home she had known since childhood. Eleanor penned a brief note explaining her decision without revealing her destination, her hands steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to do. She would not be cruel. Her father had always done what he believed was best for her, even if his vision of her happiness differed drastically from her own. The town was just beginning to stir as Eleanor slipped out the back door and made her way toward the livery stable, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Old Pete, the stable master, was already up, forking fresh hay into the stalls. He looked up in surprise as Eleanor entered, her valise clutched in one hand. "Miss Blackwood, you're out and about mighty early." Eleanor had prepared for this, her story ready on her lips. "Good morning, Pete. I need to ride out to the Peterson farm. Mrs. Peterson is feeling poorly, and Father asked me to bring her some of Martha's tonic." She held up a small bottle she had filled with water for just this purpose. The old man nodded sympathetically. "That's right Christian of you, miss. Would you like me to saddle up Daisy for you?" Eleanor nodded, relieved that her deception had been accepted without question. Daisy was her usual mount, a gentle mare that Eleanor had ridden since she was a girl. The horse would be missed almost as much as her father. With Daisy saddled and her valise secured, Eleanor led the mare out of the stable and into the alley behind, mounting quickly before guiding the horse toward the edge of town. Her plan was simple, if desperate: ride to the Morrison Ranch and somehow convince Cole Thornton to take her with him when he left with the cattle drive. It was madness, she knew. A respectable woman, throwing in her lot with a gunslinger, abandoning her father and the security of her position for an uncertain future. Yet the alternative, a lifetime of stifling conformity as Reverend Whitfield's wife, seemed the greater madness to Eleanor, as she urged Daisy into a canter once they were safely beyond the town limits. The morning air was cool against her face, the vast Wyoming landscape opening up before her like a promise of possibilities she had never before dared to imagine. Eleanor had traveled about 2 miles from town when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caused her to glance back in alarm, fearing pursuit from her father or worse, Reverend Whitfield. Instead, she saw a lone rider on a powerful black gelding, and even at a distance, she recognized the straight-backed silhouette of Cole Thornton. He quickly closed the distance between them, bringing his horse alongside hers with the easy skill of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Miss Blackwood," he said by way of greeting, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Bit early for a social call out at the Morrison place, isn't it?" Eleanor's surprise quickly gave way to suspicion. "How did you know where I was headed?" Cole's mouth quirked in the hint of a smile. "I didn't, until just now. But there's only one road leading this way from town. And a young woman, riding alone at dawn with a valise strapped to her saddle, tells its own story. For a moment, Eleanor considered denying it, claiming some innocent errand as she had with old Pete. But something in Cole's steady gaze told her that such pretense would be futile. "I'm leaving Redemption Springs," she said simply, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that dared him to judge her. Cole studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than condemning. "And you thought to what? Join up with a cattle drive? Become a cowhand?" There was no mockery in his tone, merely curiosity tinged with concern. Eleanor's grip tightened on the reins, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. "I fought to ask for your help," she admitted, the words difficult to force past the pride that had been instilled in her since childhood. "My father has arranged for me to marry Reverend Whitfield in 2 weeks' time." "I cannot do it. I will not do it." Understanding dawned in Cole's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like admiration. "So you're running away," he said, a statement rather than a question. Eleanor nodded, her determination unshaken despite the stark reality of her situation when spoken aloud. "Yes, and I'm asking you to take me with you when you leave with the cattle drive." Cole's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. "Miss Blackwood, do you have any idea what you're asking? A cattle drive is no place for a woman, especially one raised as you've been. It's weeks of dust, danger, and discomfort, with not a decent roof over your head or a soft bed to sleep in." Eleanor's gaze never wavered as she replied, "I'm not asking for comfort, Mr. Thornton. I'm asking for freedom. Something I suspect you understand the value of better than most." The gunman's expression shifted, a complex mix of emotions passing across his features before settling into a guarded neutrality. "And what would you offer in exchange for this assistance?" he asked, his voice carefully modulated. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she understood the implication, but she held his gaze steadily. "Not what you're thinking," she replied with quiet dignity. "I have $53 saved. It's yours if you help me get far enough away from here that my father can't drag me back to marry a man I don't love." Cole's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. $53 won't get you very far in this world, Miss Blackwood." Eleanor straightened in the saddle, her jaw set with determination. "Then I'll work. I can cook, clean, sew, whatever is necessary. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Thornton. I'm only afraid of living someone else's idea of what my life should be." Something shifted in Cole's expression then, a softening around the eyes that suggested her words had struck a chord. He was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing options in his mind. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to hold equal parts resignation and resolve. "There's a stage leaving from Thompson's Crossing tomorrow at noon," he said. "It's a 2-hour ride from here. I was planning to meet it myself. I have business in Cheyenne that can't wait for the cattle drive." Eleanor's heart leapt with hope, though she kept her expression carefully controlled. "You'll help me then?" Cole nodded once, decisively. "I'll see you safely to the stage, and make sure you have a ticket. After that, where you go and what you do is your own affair." It wasn't exactly what Eleanor had hoped for, but it was more than she had any right to expect from a man who owed her nothing. They had just turned their horses back toward the main road when the distant sound of multiple riders approaching fast from the direction of town caught their attention. Cole's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, his posture alert and ready. "Seems your absence has been noticed sooner than you expected," he said grimly, scanning the horizon. Through the early morning haze, Eleanor could make out at least 3 riders coming hard in their direction, dust billowing behind them. Her stomach clenched with fear as she recognized the distinctive black coat and hat of Reverend Whitfield among them, alongside the glint of a badge that could only be Sheriff Matthews. "They're coming for me," she whispered, panic threatening to overwhelm the determination that had carried her this far. Cole's expression hardened as he assessed the situation with the cool calculation of a man accustomed to danger. "Ride for the tree line," he instructed, nodding toward a dense stand of pines about half a mile to their right. "Stay low and go as fast as you can. I'll try to buy you some time." Eleanor hesitated, suddenly fearful for him, as much as for herself. "They'll see us split up. The sheriff might—" Cole cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I can handle Matthews. Go, now." There was such command in his voice that Eleanor found herself obeying without further question, turning Daisy toward the trees and urging her into a gallop. The mare responded admirably, stretching out into a ground-eating stride that quickly put distance between them and the approaching riders. Eleanor glanced back once to see Cole turning his horse to face the oncoming men, his posture relaxed but vigilant, a man preparing to stand his ground rather than flee. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a strange, fierce joy that she had never before experienced. The pine trees enveloped Eleanor like a protective embrace, the sudden dimness a stark contrast to the bright morning light of the open plains. She slowed Daisy to a walk, guiding the mare carefully through the undergrowth as she listened for any sounds of pursuit. For several tense minutes, there was nothing but the soft huffing of the horse's breath and the occasional snap of a twig beneath hooves. Then came the distant sound of raised voices, too far away to distinguish words, but clear enough to identify the anger in their tone. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly on the reins as she waited, uncertain whether to press deeper into the forest or remain where she was. The decision was made for her when she heard the unmistakable crack of a gunshot, followed by another. Her heart seemed to stop in her chest, fear for Cole overwhelming all other concerns. Before Eleanor could decide on a course of action, the sound of a horse approaching at speed through the trees reached her ears. She backed Daisy deeper into the shadows, preparing to flee if necessary. Relief flooded through her as Cole appeared, his black gelding moving with remarkable agility through the dense forest. "Time to go," he said without preamble, his expression grim but determined. "Matthews is more persistent than I gave him credit for." Eleanor scanned him quickly for signs of injury, noting with relief that he appeared unharmed despite the gunshots she had heard. "What happened?" she asked, as they set their horses in motion, deeper into the forest and away from the road. Cole's mouth set in a hard line. "Your reverend seems to think I've kidnapped you." "Tried to place me under arrest for interfering with a young lady's virtue. When I declined his invitation, things got heated." "You shot at them?" Eleanor asked, horror mingling with a strange, wild exhilaration at the thought of such open defiance. Cole shook his head, guiding his horse around a fallen log with easy expertise. "Shot in the air. I've no desire to kill a lawman or a preacher, no matter how self-righteous they might be. But they'll be following our trail, though, and they'll have more men joining the search once they send word back to town." He glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Last chance to change your mind, Miss Blackwood. Say the word, and I'll lead you back to them. You can claim I misled you, took you against your will." They'll believe it readily enough. The offer was genuine. Eleanor could see that. A final opportunity to return to the safety and certainty of her previous life. For the briefest moment, she wavered, the enormity of what she was doing threatening to overwhelm her courage. Then she thought of Reverend Whitfield's cool, possessive touch, of her father's dismissal of her desires in favor of his own plans for her future, of the suffocating predictability that awaited her as a preacher's wife in a small frontier town. "No," she said, her voice stronger and more certain than she had expected. "I've made my choice, Mr. Thornton. I'll face whatever comes of it." Something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes before he nodded once, turning his attention back to the path ahead. "Then we ride for Thompson's Crossing, but not by any route they'll expect. I know these hills better than most. There's a trail through the high country that few use these days. It'll be rough going in places, but it'll keep us well away from any search parties." Eleanor nodded her agreement, straightening her spine and setting her face toward the unknown future that awaited beyond the horizon. The day stretched into a grueling test of endurance as Cole led them through increasingly rugged terrain, following game trails and ancient Indian paths that wound through narrow valleys and across steep ridges. Eleanor, despite her determination, found herself struggling to keep up, unused to such prolonged hours in the saddle over difficult ground. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her fine riding clothes, designed more for appearance than practicality, offered little protection against the scratching branches and occasional sharp rocks that Daisy navigated with patient care. Yet Eleanor refused to complain, gritting her teeth against the discomfort and focusing instead on the freedom each mile put between her and Redemption Springs. Cole maintained a watchful silence for much of the journey, stopping occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit or to check their back trail, his caution a constant reminder of the seriousness of their situation. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, promising a storm before nightfall. Cole finally called a halt in a small, sheltered clearing beside a narrow stream, dismounting with the fluid grace that Eleanor had come to associate with him. "We'll rest the horses and ourselves for a bit," he said, leading his gelding to the water. "There's a line shack about 2 hours' ride from here, where we can take shelter for the night. We should reach it before the worst of the storm hits." Eleanor slid awkwardly from Daisy's back, her legs nearly buckling as her feet touched the ground. She stumbled, catching herself against the saddle as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. Cole was at her side in an instant, strong hands steadying her without being overly familiar. "First time riding this hard?" he asked, his tone gentler than she had yet heard it. Eleanor managed a wan smile, embarrassed by her weakness. "Is it that obvious?" Cole's answering smile was brief but genuine, transforming his features in a way that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat, despite her fatigue. "Most men would be in worse shape after the trail we've covered today," he said, releasing her once he was sure she could stand on her own. "You've got grit, Miss Blackwood. That'll serve you well where you're heading." The simple praise warmed Eleanor more than she cared to admit, bolstering her resolve as she led Daisy to the stream. As the horses drank, Cole produced a small packet of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, offering half to Eleanor. "Not exactly the fancy fare you're used to, I expect," he said, as she accepted the meager provisions with murmured thanks. Eleanor shook her head, biting into the tough, salty meat with unexpected relish. "You'd be surprised at what I'm used to, Mr. Thornton. My father may be prosperous now, but our first years in Redemption Springs were lean ones. I've eaten my share of stringy rabbit and mushy beans." They ate in companionable silence, The only sounds the gentle munching of the horses as they grazed on the sparse grass and the distant rumble of thunder approaching from the west. Eleanor studied Cole covertly as he scanned the surrounding forest with the habitual vigilance of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. In the filtered light beneath the trees, the hard lines of his face seemed somehow less severe, the wariness in his eyes tempered by something that might almost be contentment in this moment of respite. "May I ask you something, Mr. Thornton?" she ventured, when the silence had stretched long enough to become comfortable rather than awkward. He glanced at her, a single eyebrow raised in silent permission. "Why are you helping me? You gain nothing from it. In fact, you've put yourself at considerable risk on my behalf. A man with your reputation doesn't strike me as the chivalrous type without reason." Cole considered her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that seemed oddly vulnerable. "Let's just say I understand something about being forced down a path not of your choosing," he said finally, his voice holding an edge of old bitterness, "and about the cost of breaking free from it." He fell silent, and Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, much more, but that he was unlikely to share it, at least not now. Instead, she nodded her acceptance of what he had offered, recognizing the gift of even this small confidence from a man who clearly guarded his privacy as fiercely as his life. "Well, whatever your reasons," she said quietly, "I'm grateful, more than I can properly express." A hint of that rare smile touched his lips again, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Save your gratitude until we've gotten you safely on that stage, Miss Blackwood. We've still got a ways to go, and I wouldn't put it past your reverend to have men watching the crossing." True to Cole's prediction, the storm broke in earnest just as they reached the line shack, a crude but sturdy structure nestled against the side of a hill and half hidden by dense pine trees. Rain lashed at them in heavy sheets, driven by gusting wind, as they hurriedly unsaddled the horses and led them into the small lean-to attached to one side of the cabin. Inside, the shack was spare but functional. A narrow cot against one wall, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and a small fireplace with a stack of dry wood beside it. Cole quickly set about building a fire, while Eleanor stood dripping and shivering just inside the door, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. To be alone in such close quarters with a man, any man, but especially one like Cole Thornton, was beyond scandalous. If anyone from Redemption Springs could see her now, her reputation would be irrevocably ruined. Yet as the fire caught and spread its golden light and blessed warmth through the small space, Eleanor found she cared less about propriety than she ever had before. The old rules, the rigid expectations that had governed her every action since childhood, seemed increasingly meaningless the further she traveled from their source. Cole worked with quiet efficiency, hanging their soaked outer garments near the fire to dry and setting a small pot of coffee to boil on the flames. "You should change into something dry if you have it," he said, pointedly keeping his back to her as he arranged their gear. "I'll step outside for a bit and check on the horses." Before Eleanor could protest that he would be soaked all over again, he had slipped out the door, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and her own turbulent thoughts. By the time Cole returned, Eleanor had changed into her spare blouse and skirt and had managed to comb some semblance of order into her damp hair with her fingers. She sat on the edge of the cot, hands folded in her lap, feeling oddly shy as he entered, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Coffee's ready," she said, nodding toward the pot on the fire, "and I found some canned beans in the cupboard. Not much of a meal, but better than nothing." Cole his dripping coat and hat, hanging them beside their other clothes before accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. "You're full of surprises, Miss Blackwood," he said, the warmth in his voice sending an unexpected thrill through her. "Most women of your standing would be having hysterics by now, alone in a line shack with a notorious gunman during a thunderstorm." Eleanor smiled, some of her nervousness easing at his teasing tone. "Perhaps I'm not as proper as I appear, Mr. Thornton." The night deepened around them as the storm continued its assault on the small cabin. Rain drumming on the roof and wind howling through the surrounding trees like a living thing. They shared the meager meal of beans and the last of the hardtack, talking little but finding a surprising comfort in each other's presence. When it came time to sleep, Cole insisted Eleanor take the cot while he made do with his bedroll on the floor beside the fire. "I've slept on worse," he said when she protested the arrangement, "and I'll sleep better knowing you're comfortable." There was something in the way he said it, a gentleness beneath the gruff exterior, that touched Eleanor deeply. As she lay on the narrow cot, listening to the steady rhythm of Cole's breathing and the crackling of the fire, she found herself contemplating the strange turn her life had taken in the space of a single day. Tomorrow, if all went according to plan, she would board a stage to a destination she had not yet determined, leaving behind everything and everyone she had ever known. The thought should have terrified her, yet instead, she felt an exhilarating sense of possibility that made sleep elusive despite her physical exhaustion. "Mr. Thornton?" she whispered into the darkness, uncertain if he was still awake. There was a moment of silence before his deep voice responded. "Cole, if we're going to be fugitives together, you might as well use my given name." Eleanor smiled into the darkness, savoring this small intimacy. "Cole, then, and you should call me Eleanor." Another pause. Then, "Eleanor." Just her name, but the way he said it, like something precious being tasted for the first time, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "May I ask you something else?" she continued, emboldened by the darkness and the strange suspended quality of the moment. "What will you do after? After tomorrow? Will you go back to the Morrison Ranch?" There was a rustle as he shifted position, and Eleanor could picture him staring up at the rafters, his profile illuminated by the dying firelight. "No," he said finally. "That job was just a way station, like most. I never stay anywhere long." The admission, simple as it was, carried a weight of solitude that Eleanor could feel across the small space separating them. "Doesn't that get lonely?" she asked softly, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. Cole's chuckle was low and without much humor. "Lonely is different from alone, Eleanor. I've been alone most of my life. It suits me." Yet there was something in his tone that belied the words, a hint of resignation that suggested the solitary path he walked was not entirely by choice. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation away from himself. "Where will you go from Thompson's Crossing? You must have had some destination in mind when you decided to run." Eleanor sighed, the question bringing her back to the practicalities she had been avoiding. "Denver, perhaps, or San Francisco, somewhere big enough to get lost in, where a woman alone might find work that doesn't require compromising herself." "It won't be easy," Cole said, not unkindly but with the frankness she had come to expect from him. "The world isn't kind to women without protection, especially those with education and refinement like yours. Men will see you as either a target or a challenge." Eleanor's hands clenched in the rough blanket covering her. Then I'll have to prove them wrong, won't I? I may have led a sheltered life in many ways, but I'm not naive, Cole. I know what I'm risking. I know it might end badly, but at least it will be my choice, my life to live as I see fit. The silence that followed her declaration was filled with the sound of the rain, gradually lessening as the storm moved off to the east. Just as Eleanor thought Cole had fallen asleep, his voice came again, softer now, but clear in the quiet cabin. For what it's worth, I think you'll do just fine, Eleanor Blackwood. You've got more steel in your spine than most men I've known. Morning came with a clarity that seemed to wash the world clean, the storm having passed during the night to leave a sky of perfect blue. Eleanor woke to find Cole already up and moving about the cabin, his expression alert but relaxed as he prepared a simple breakfast from their limited supplies. "Storm's blown itself out," he said by way of greeting, handing her a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven after the trials of the previous day. "If we leave within the hour, we should reach Thompson's Crossing with time to spare before the stage arrives." Eleanor nodded, sipping the strong brew gratefully as she tried to tame her sleep-mussed hair into some semblance of order. Their brief domesticity felt strangely natural, as if they had known each other far longer than the mere days since Cole's arrival in Redemption Springs. It was a dangerous feeling, Eleanor knew, this easy companionship with a man who, by his own admission, never stayed anywhere long. Yet she couldn't help savoring it, storing away the memory of this morning for the uncertain days ahead. They rode out as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, the landscape transformed by the recent rain into a palette of vivid greens and golds that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Cole set a more moderate pace than the previous day, their need for haste balanced against the risk of laming the horses on the still treacherous ground. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts, as the miles passed beneath their horses' steady hooves. When Thompson's Crossing finally came into view, little more than a trading post, a stable, and a crude platform where the stage would stop, Cole raised a hand for Eleanor to halt, studying the small settlement with narrowed eyes. "Seems quiet enough," he said after a moment, "but we'll approach carefully. If your father had the sense I think he does, he'll have sent word ahead to watch for you." Cole's caution proved well-founded. As they drew closer, keeping to the cover of trees that flanked the road, Eleanor spotted two men lounging near the trading post, rifles propped casually against the wall beside them. "Matthew's deputies?" she whispered, her heart sinking at this final obstacle. Cole shook his head slightly. "Don't recognize them. Could be just travelers waiting for the stage, same as you'll be. But we won't take chances." He pointed to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the crossing from the south. "We'll circle around and wait there until the stage arrives. Better vantage point, and we can see who those men really are before making our move." Eleanor nodded, following his lead as they guided their horses in a wide arc that kept them well out of sight of the settlement. The rocky promontory offered both cover and an excellent view of the crossing, and they dismounted in its shadow, tethering the horses securely before crawling to a position where they could observe without being seen. Time seemed to stretch interminably as they waited, the sun climbing to its peak and then beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. Eleanor found herself increasingly tense as the appointed hour approached, her future hanging in the balance of the next few minutes. "There," Cole murmured suddenly, pointing toward a cloud of dust visible on the eastern road. "Stage is coming." Eleanor's heart leapt at the sight, hope and fear warring within her chest. The two men they had spotted earlier straightened as well, one shading his eyes to peer down the road, while the other checked his rifle with casual efficiency. "I don't like the look of this," Cole muttered, his hand dropping instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Those men are too interested in that stage for my liking." As if to confirm his suspicions, the men moved to position themselves on either side of the road, their postures alert and ready, in a way that spoke of intentions far removed from peaceful travel. "Road agents," Cole said grimly, watching as the two men drew bandanas up to cover the lower halves of their faces. "They're planning to rob the stage." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. "We have to warn them." Cole's expression hardened, calculation replacing concern as he assessed the situation with the cool precision of a chess master. "Those two are probably not alone," he said, scanning the surrounding area with renewed intensity. "There'll be others waiting to ambush the stage where the driver can't easily turn around or outrun them." He glanced at Eleanor, his decision already made, though he asked the question anyway. "Stay here, out of sight. I'm going to even the odds a bit." Eleanor shook her head fiercely, gripping his arm before he could rise. "It's too dangerous. Two against how many? You don't even know." The smile Cole gave her then was unlike any she had seen on his face before. Fierce, alive with a dangerous energy that both frightened and fascinated her. "Dangerous is what I do best, Eleanor. Trust me." Before she could argue further, he was gone, sliding down the backside of the outcropping toward where their horses were tethered. Eleanor watched helplessly as he mounted his black gelding and rode at a breakneck pace along a path that would bring him to the road well ahead of the approaching stage, yet out of sight of the waiting robbers. The stage was closer now, the thunder of hooves and rattle of wheels clearly audible as the driver pushed his team hard over the final stretch of road. The two bandits had taken up positions behind a large boulder and a fallen tree trunk respectively, rifles aimed and ready as the stage approached the final bend before the crossing. What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Eleanor breathless. As the stage rounded the bend, Cole Thornton burst from the trees directly in its path, firing his revolver into the air. The startled driver hauled back on the reins, the team of horses rearing and snorting as the stage skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust. In the same moment, the two bandits rose from their hiding places, clearly confused by this unexpected development. Cole's voice carried clearly to where Eleanor watched, the authority in his tone brooking no argument. "Stage is being ambushed. Hostiles at 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock. The driver and the shotgun messenger reacted instantly to the warning, the latter swinging his weapon toward the nearest bandit, while the driver drew a pistol from beneath his seat. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of rifles mingling with the deeper boom of the shotgun, as Cole spurred his horse alongside the stage, providing covering fire that forced the bandits to duck for cover. In the confusion, 3 more men emerged from hiding further down the road, realizing their ambush had been discovered. They charged toward the stage, guns blazing, determined to complete their robbery despite the unexpected resistance. Eleanor watched in horror as bullets whined around Cole and the stage, splintering wood and kicking up dust with their impact. Yet Cole seemed almost to dance among the chaos, his revolver speaking with deadly accuracy as he picked off one of the charging bandits with a shot that sent the man tumbling from his saddle. The shotgun messenger accounted for another, the heavy load of buckshot finding its mark with devastating effect. The remaining bandits, seeing their advantage lost, broke and ran, disappearing into the trees with the surviving members of their gang as quickly as they had appeared. The entire encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet in that brief span, Eleanor had witnessed more violence than in all her previous years combined. As the dust settled, Cole approached the stage cautiously, his revolver still in hand, though no longer aimed. Words were exchanged with the driver and messenger that Eleanor couldn't hear from her position. But she could see the men nodding vigorously, clearly expressing their gratitude for the timely warning. After a brief discussion, Cole turned and rode directly toward the outcropping where Eleanor waited, a clear signal that it was safe for her to emerge. She scrambled down to where Daisy was tethered, mounting quickly and riding to meet him halfway. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever witnessed," she said as they met, her voice shaking slightly with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Cole holstered his revolver with a shrug that belied the danger he had just faced. "Sometimes they're one and the same. Stage drivers mighty grateful enough to ensure you get a seat without too many questions asked." The stage stood waiting as Cole and Eleanor rode into Thompson's Crossing, the driver busy securing a replacement for one of the team that had been injured in the chaos while the messenger kept watch, his shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. 3 passengers had disembarked during the excitement: a drummer with a case of samples, a matronly woman clutching a carpet bag, and a young man who looked to be barely out of his teens. All 3 watched with undisguised curiosity as Cole helped Eleanor dismount, their whispers barely audible as they speculated on the relationship between the elegant young woman and the dangerous-looking man in black. The stage driver approached as Cole secured Daisy's reins to the hitching post, extending a weathered hand in gratitude. "Name's Jackson, miss. Your husband here saved our hides, and no mistake. Them road agents would have had us dead to rights if he hadn't warned us." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the man's assumption, but didn't correct him, sensing that the pretense might smooth her passage. Cole handled the arrangements with efficient grace, paying for Eleanor's ticket to Denver with money she suspected he could ill afford to spend. When she tried to give him the $53 she had brought with her, he refused with a shake of his head. "Keep it. You'll need it more than I will where you're going." The final preparations for departure were made with brisk efficiency. Eleanor's valise secured on top of the coach, along with the other passengers' luggage. Fresh horses harnessed and ready. All too soon, it was time for goodbyes, a moment Eleanor had been both anticipating and dreading since they had left the line shack that morning. Cole drew her slightly away from the others, his expression softening as he looked down at her. "This is where we part ways, Eleanor Blackwood," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Denver's a good choice, big enough to get lost in, but not so big that a woman alone can't find her footing." Eleanor nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the lump that had formed in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she managed finally, painfully aware that within minutes she would likely never see this man again, this enigmatic, dangerous, surprisingly gentle man who had risked everything to help a stranger find her freedom. Cole's smile was tinged with a sadness that matched her own. "Live your life on your own terms," he said simply. "That's thanks enough." The stage driver called for passengers to board, his voice breaking the moment between them. Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for this final step into the unknown. Before she could move toward the stage, Cole caught her hand, his touch sending a shock of awareness through her that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the man himself. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rougher than she had heard it before. "If things were different." He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them, filled with possibilities neither of them could afford to explore. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the unfairness of it all suddenly overwhelming. In another life, another time, perhaps. But not in this one. Not with who they were and the paths they had chosen. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand briefly before releasing it. "Be safe, Cole Thornton." He nodded once, stepping back as she gathered her skirts and moved toward the waiting stage, his eyes never leaving her as she climbed aboard with the assistance of the young drummer. As the stage lurched into motion, Eleanor looked back through the window, committing to memory the sight of Cole standing beside his black gelding, tall and straight against the backdrop of the wild Wyoming landscape. He raised a hand in farewell, a gesture she returned with a smile that held both sadness and a newfound determination. The stage rounded a bend in the road, and he was lost to view, though Eleanor knew his image would remain with her long after the dust of their meeting had settled. She turned to face forward, toward Denver and whatever awaited her there, a woman traveling alone, but carrying within her the strength she had discovered in herself and the memory of a gunman who smelled of sin and freedom. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Blackwood was truly free, the author of her own story, the mistress of her own fate, and for now, that was enough. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.